I can
Okay,
hear
good.
you.
This is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. It's my pleasure again to have on Paul McCusker and Phil Lawler, who hardly need any introductions. Thank you so much for showing up tonight. This will be a very interesting conversation.
Thanks.
So I think the thing we need to start with is what is art? I know I sound a little pedestrian, but I think the definition of art that we find on Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, it's fairly good. The conscious use of skill and creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. That's more of a mechanistic description of art. I think two other elements need to be added. The other element is what art should strive to do is get us closer to the true, the beautiful, and the good. And as Christians, I think we all agree that Christ himself is the embodiment and the fullness of all three. And then lastly, it kind of gets into the idea of myth that Lewis and Tolkien were big on. If I'm not mistaken, it might be at the end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Lucy and Edmund are too old to return to Narnia. And Lucy says, "Will I ever see you again?" to Aslan. And Aslan says, "You know me in your own world by another name. And you came to Narnia here to learn how to best serve me in your own world." So in a lot of ways, literature and myth and film and music, basically the way I like to put it is, ordinary virtues are placed in extraordinary circumstances to help us better relate to them. So I like to. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, since Phil teaches this stuff, I'd love to hear what Phil thinks of it first.
Well, I think that we are jumping in. We may be jumping in the middle of the conversation rather than starting from the beginning of the conversation. And I would hate to have to. I don't want to have to go back over things that everybody already knows. But I think that in any kind of a discussion of art and what art is, what I think we're really looking for is some sort of standard that we could judge things by. So I think that we have standards that we try in every other philosophical way, in every other measure of life. We have these kinds of standards that we kind of look for. But when it comes to art, we're really reticent to do that, and yet we all have them. We all have the standard that we say, okay, something is art, something is not art, even though we don't want to pinpoint exactly what that standard is. So for myself, the conversations that I've been having with my classroom, and again, all of this is very much up in the air with my students and everything else. Like I've been really trying to find out for myself, and through conversations with them and conversations like this, how do we come across that standard we do when we say what is art? What answer can we possibly give? One thing that I think we have to try to start with is that we all do have some sort of standard that we judge it by. We all do look at some sort of way of judging whether something is art or something is not art. And so for me, I look at it and say it goes back to scripture for me. The fourth word of the Bible is God. The fifth word of the Bible that starts the Genesis account of creation is created. And that means for me, I look at that and say, well, okay, it doesn't say in the beginning God pondered, in the beginning God wondered, in the beginning God contemplated. It says, no, in the beginning God created. And what did he create? Well, he created the world. He created light from darkness, separated the two. He created sea from land, separated those two. He created all the vegetation. He created all the animals. He created everything in the world, in the universe, put the stars up in the sky. After each day's work, after each time period that he did his creation, he looked back on it and he said, what? It is good. It is good. And then when finally he made his biggest creation, his most glorious creation, which was mankind, humans, male and female. He made them in his image. He looked back on it and he said, it is not just good, it is very good. And so I would have to say that is a standard right there of aesthetics. God looks back on his own creation and he ascribes it as good and very good. And then we are created in his image. So we are created to be creative by the creator of creativity. So that means in his image, we are created to be creative in his image, which means that we look back on it and say, okay, great. What are we supposed to create, and how do we know that it is good? We are supposed to create in our creator's image. When he created, he looked back and said it was good. So when we create, how can we know what we are creating is good? Well, we create it to reflect his image and his glory and his truth and his beauty. And then how do we know that? How do we know that that's what it is? Well, we know that's what it is because Jesus talked about himself as part of the Godhead three. Jesus talked about himself and said, I am the way, the truth, the life. So we know the truth is part of art. And this goes back to kind of what you were saying too, Todd, I think in the beginning when you're talking about the definitions of art, we're talking about how all that works. All that ties in together to say, okay, well, our standard of art then should be a reflection of who the Father is, a reflection of who God is, a reflection of how he created. And then we are to create also as created beings created in his image. Okay, so that gives us a standard to go by. That for me starts the conversation. When somebody asks me, when my students ask me, what is art? I'd say, how do you judge art? I say, well, we have to have a standard. What is the standard? God. God is the standard of art. And so I'll leave that there and see if maybe Paul wants to weigh in now. That's sort of the basis for me. I just think we have to have this foundation of saying what we're really truly asking here is there a standard? Is there some sort of standard that we could go by to say, okay, we now have a standard that we can look at for what art is?
Yeah, and I would agree. And it's interesting because, historically, philosophically, as you say, often it isn't so much the definition of art as it is the standard by which art is judged. Is art or isn't it? And I blow my nose in a handkerchief and put it on display in a museum, and I call that art, and so it is. So I agree, and I think it's astute that you point to all of those things in Genesis to indicate kind of where the starting point is for our standard. Because I had a conversation with someone earlier today, and we were talking about God as creator. And one of the sometimes controversial things, and Phil and you and I've talked about this, that the creative spark, as you said, and I think it was Dorothy Sayers who pointed out that before we know anything else about God, God is Father, God is King, God is anything else, it's that he is creative. And that's part of the image, what he's instilled in us, what Tolkien called, we're co-creators, sub-creators, because he created. Now, where I've gotten into trouble on various occasions, I've said, so that means everybody who creates is only able to create because it's instilled in them to do that from God. So that means even if they're creating pornography, they are still acting on that creative spark that came from God. So sometimes they get in trouble because we always think, and a lot of people think, oh, well, if it's creative and it came from God, then that means you're only going to create things that glorify God or point to good and true and beautiful. But like everything else in creation, things can be corrupted. So the creative spark that God put into us as part of his image is then basically corrupted and taken into other directions. It's no less creative. In fact, I think we'd agree that some incredibly creative music and stories and movies and shows that we've loved over the years came from people who had absolutely no knowledge of or allegiance to God, and yet they were acting on their creative spark and created amazing things.
Right.
So,
right.
So then as we get into the question, my question comes back to, I love the standard you gave, which would be, that we're acting on his image, that we have a call basically for our art to point to truth and to represent truth, but also to represent life or to be life-giving in some form. If I could expand on what you were saying a little bit, But what do you do with people who are incredibly creative, but would say, and we would agree that they're creative, that what they've created is art, and yet it sort of isn't any of those things. You look at some of the great writers and the great painters and people who have actually done remarkable stuff in music and everything else, but you kind of come away. There's a particular filmmaker you and I've talked about, who we've joked that his films tend to be, you're born, you live, you do terrible things to other people, or they do terrible things to you, and then you die a meaningless death. And the artistry of what he does in terms of how he makes his movies and the actors he gets to act them out. I mean, lots of people point and say, wow, that's amazing artistry. And yet he often doesn't do any of the things that we've just described as being sort of the standard for true art. So how would you respond to that?
Well, I think that in part what that deals with is, and this may be at the core of what you're saying here, what you're asking here, because the next step, once we say, okay, if the standard is God, the next step is, well, what if I don't believe in God? What if we have no God? What if I just don't believe in that? So that's where I think that any discussion that we have on art is inextricably linked to theology in certain ways. We're talking about an aesthetic. If I were to write this in a book, I would really love to do at some point. If I ever wanted to go get a PhD, my thesis would be called Toward an Objective Aesthetic. Can we even have one? Can we even do that? So, and then of course that circles back to yes, I believe we can, because we have God. So those people that you're talking about, filmmaker in particular, for instance, Paul, if we took that filmmaker out to view the Grand Canyon, or to view the Pacific Ocean, to view the Rocky Mountains in certain times of the year, or to view any kind of, they would look at that and say, that's beautiful. The most wretched person who the person who wants to present the most wretched, seedy side of humanity as art, you still take them to these places and they go, yes, that's beautiful. Yes, that instills in me a sense of beauty. So we have this sense about us that says, okay, that's beauty, that's beautiful. Now, of course, we can get very, very philosophical and say, this is the sound of one hand clapping. If a tree falls on the floor, says anybody, who doesn't make a sound. If no humans were here, would that still be beautiful? I say, yes, it would be, because God created it. Okay. And so that means beauty is outside of us that we didn't create. The sense of beauty is outside of us that we didn't create, but it is instilled in us. And as a justification for that, I would use Romans. I would use the first chapter of Romans. When the writer of Romans says to his audience, the people who's writing to, he says, they knew God, but they did not acknowledge him or recognize him as God. And so they are without excuse. They are without excuse. So they traded the image of God. They traded God for the creator for something that's created. They worship something that's created instead of the creator to be worshipped forever and ever. So we go through all of that and we say, now I know that Paul is talking there about certain, it seems to be he's talking about certain morality things, but I think this also applies to aesthetics. God instilled in us, I believe, and I believe that Romans is justification for this, a sense of his beauty, how to recognize it, how to recognize what is truly beautiful, what is truth, what is beauty, and what is artistic. That's innate in us. We choose through fallenness and sin to suppress our idea of what is, to suppress our ability to discern what is beautiful and true. We purposefully do that. And we do that to the point where pretty soon we don't really know what's beautiful and what's true. And so we have to rely on things like, well, it's just in the eye of the beholder. Well, it's just whatever we say it is. It's just, but if we say that, art can't just be whatever we say it is at any given time. We go back to the beginning of The Incredibles, or the climax of The Incredibles, where the villain says, if everybody has superpowers, then nobody will have superpowers. Well, if everything is art, then nothing is art. We have to kind of draw these lines, and we have this innate sense. Even again, the person who would reject God completely, these people who would reject God completely, still have a sense of order. They still have a sense of construction, how they're telling their stories, how they're presenting their stories. They still have a contrast in their stories. These various filmmakers that we're talking about, these very people, have a contrast of what seems to be good, what seems to be bad. How would they even know what good and bad is unless that's instinctive inside of them? This goes back to all the philosophical side. All these things are all tied together, and they have to be tied together within art as well. So I interpret that then as saying we are without excuse when we claim that which is beautiful is not beautiful. We are without excuse when we try to claim that which is truth is not truth. Because it has been instilled in us, as Romans says, it has been instilled in us. We are without excuse. And when we trade the glorious creator, our worship of the glorious creator, to worship images, the created thing instead of the creator, then we are without excuse. And I think we know it. And I think that's why a lot of these folks that we're talking about are considered daring. And considered, they're pushing the edge of the envelope. Well, what envelope are you talking about? When you use that, you're framing the whole conversation of there's some sort of standard that they're moving beyond, or they're moving outside of, or they're doing that, and they know it, and so now they're being praised for knowing it. Now, going back to just a second, if I may, really quickly add on to that, which is everybody has a God. I'm borrowing from Douglas Wilson, from Pastor Douglas Wilson up in Idaho for this. I think that he is correct when he says everybody has a God. God is your court of highest appeal. God is your last court of appeal. So if you're facing a dilemma in your life, if you're facing some sort of decision that you have to make, if you're contemplating, if you need comfort, all those things that we would turn to God to, we as Christians turn to God to, everybody has that at some point. That could be the state. It could be the people. It could be just general populace. It could be science. A lot of people these days, their God is science. Well, I'm not quite sure that any of those are fully adequate to help us decide what art is. In fact, all of them seem to be just the opposite. They're going to be very utilitarian in basically whatever brings the greatest amount of pleasure over pain for the most number of people possible. So that's where I would go with all of this. I mean, Wilson just brought up a point recently in one of his talks where he says all the stuff that's going, as an example, all of the stuff that's going on with guns right now. Who are the people crying out to? The people are crying out, and in the Old Testament, when things got really, really bad, the people cried out to the God who created them. Now, who are the people crying out to? The government. Please, you've got to solve this problem for us. We're having all of these terrible things happen. We've got to go to a court of last appeal. That's the government. And then, of course, we realize just how inadequate that God is. So, and especially when it becomes to something like art. How does this all tie back to art? Well, again, we have this standard embedded in us that we are choosing. In many cases, we are choosing to suppress the ability to discern good from bad and truth from falsehood.
Yeah, and I think to add to that is the sense of willful ignorance, willful blindness, or the blindness that happens over time, because in that diabolical way, you have people who are for diabolical reasons or just out of their own intention, or arguing about celebrating. I mean, just look at what we celebrate. We celebrate disfigurement. We celebrate what is ugly. We actually the culture is trying to celebrate things that are complete distortions from God's original intention and plan, and they can do that. But as we know, the slippery slope is always, you do that often enough and your understanding becomes blinded. Our understanding of beauty becomes disfigured. So we're looking at something and we genuinely think it's beautiful, and it's not. The other thing that I've gotten in trouble about is over the issue of, and it's I don't want to rabbit trail into worship, but to your statement about the Grand Canyon, it's like, well, is it beautiful if no one's there to see it? Well, the fact is God does see it. And the question is, does God think it's beautiful? And my guess is because he created it, or was however it played out, he would say, yes, it's beautiful. You think it's beautiful because I think it's beautiful. And I have the same argument about, when we discuss like worship, what kind of worship? Is there a kind of worship that God actually prefers over other types of worship, even the kind of worship that we say is meaningful to us? And I point back to the Old Testament and say that there's God who creates a temple that is not utilitarian, as Francis Schaeffer would have pointed out. He said this temple was laden with gold. It was created to be a beautiful place of worship, not functional. I suppose you could have people saying, oh, you should have given the money to the poor, or whatever the case may be. But God instructed them to make it beautiful, then gave them instructions for the kind of worship that was supposed to happen in there, which presumably he thought was beautiful. And I don't remember the point where he said, is this good for you? Is this okay for you? Because I really want it to be meaningful for you. I can't find the verse. So when we're looking at these questions about goodness and truth and beauty and the standard, I'm kind of looking at that in a lot of the ways we argue now and say, well, what does God have to say about it? What does God think is beautiful? What does God think we ought to think is beautiful? And so coming back to the example from Romans, I think that's it. When Paul writes in Romans 1 about people who have become willfully ignorant, they've become willfully blind, and possibly to the point that they don't even recognize it anymore. Or you also then have, and this is the other question, and we talked about this a lot, Phil, about the last battle by C.S. Lewis, where you actually had people, you had Emmett, who was worshiping the wrong God. And Aslan basically says, I'm accepting your worship for him because you intended it for me.
Yeah.
And there are times when I do think, much as on Mars Hill, you had all these statues and the unknown God, and Paul points to that and said, you're ignorant. You don't know what you've been doing, but that's the God. So I think there is a beauty that comes from the uninformed, those who do not believe, because they're actually trying to celebrate something they don't understand. They're actually creating beauty and a kind of goodness for the God they don't see yet, hopefully, right. And presumably at some point they will.
Yeah.
And so, when we talk about certain artists that we go, well, this person is just, doesn't believe in God, in fact, speaks out against God, and yet somehow seems to create some sort of beauty and beautiful art. I think then you begin to wonder, again, the creative spark allows that beauty to creep into what they're doing, even out of their ignorance. Yeah. Much as you have a lot of Christians who are trying to create good art and they wind up not doing it. So they have good intentions, but they actually are misdirected because they haven't explored the disciplines of it. They don't understand what it is, or they're just thinking of it as utilitarian. So that's what all came to mind as you were talking about these things.
Well, and that's one of the things in my classroom that we talk about quite a bit too in my classes, which is, does God care about this? Does God care about art? Does God care about culture? Because we have, especially like popular culture, so we have a great many, I think, church leaders, and I don't want to brag on anybody, so I'm not going to name any names, but we've had this in the past, and we probably have grown up in the same kind of situation, Paul, where the church seemed to retreat. And it was the message that we were getting was, God doesn't care about that. That's not important to God. And we think, well, wait a minute, that can't be right. Especially when, as you just rightly pointed out, look at the instructions that God gave for the building of the tabernacle, the temple and the tabernacle. Wow. I mean, he could have said, okay, just get some canvas, throw up a tent, make sure that you're here. I'll come down and, whatever. But no, he said, the finest cloth, the finest gold, the finest this. Here are the specifications. Here's exactly how it's to be done. And did he think that we were doing it? I'm going to build this to be displeasing to you. I'm going to build this to look displeasing. Well, that would make him not a God that makes sense. That would make him a God that doesn't make any sense. Why would he do that? And I don't think an attribute of God is that he doesn't make sense. I think God does things that make sense. We may not always understand it at the time, but ultimately they make sense. Now, I just want to say, at this point in the conversation, usually when not just you and I are talking, but when I have talked to students and people in the past, what usually comes up is a lot of, you get the stiff neck thing, and you get people who are backing off, and they don't like this idea of standards, and they don't like this idea of, oh, well, you're just selling. And I always have to tell my students, okay, I just want to separate something here. What we're talking about is, let's put what we're talking about here over on the side. This has nothing to do with what you like and what you dislike, because what you like and what you dislike are personal choices, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking here, what we're trying to do, again, is come toward an objective aesthetic, and an objective aesthetic would be fact-based, and as Ben Shapiro likes to say, facts don't care about your feelings, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You can have all sorts of likes, you can like whatever you want, like it, dislike whatever you want, that's fine. And all of us do. All of us have these likes and dislikes, and that's
there's
perfect.
bad music. Yeah, you have bad music that people think. You know, there was a popular book that came out a few years ago, which I thought was a horrible book. I thought it was a bad book in the sense of being badly written and badly done, and yet it was hugely popular, and so a lot of people liked it. Now, I wasn't talking about whether the author was morally good or bad. I wasn't talking about whether the book itself was morally bad. I was just thinking in terms of it was badly written. I mean, we've all had, choirs, or we've all had singers, who fit into different categories of, good music done badly or bad music done really well. And,
Right.
and you have the variation. So it is very important to understand that we are talking about a more objective understanding of art and what the attributes of art is and how we measure, is
Right.
that art, or is it good art or bad art, or is it art at all? And I think, to your other point, I think in the 20th century, but it might have started if we went back to Cromwell, in the 1600s, with the destroy the stained glass windows, destroy all these different things, up to the utilitarian view that we have now. And it is utilitarian. I mean, when you have a lot of people worshiping in gymnasiums, they're in these very functional buildings that serve another function when they're not in there in their folded chairs worshiping, or whatever the case may be. You're right. I think we in Christendom, in many areas, maybe it's in America, maybe other parts of the world, stepped back, and we actually gave artistry to everyone else. And Christians kind of just that we stopped teaching it in school. We stopped doing it properly. The only thing that happened in a lot of the evangelical circles and other circles, is that you had the utilitarian of an evangelistic form of art. That if it wasn't evangelistic and pointed directly to God, or brought people into a personal relationship of Jesus Christ in a most overt way, then it's no good, and don't bother with it. You and I, for years, have talked about drama in the context of church. And we knew pastors who loved the idea of drama.
Yeah.
But as soon as you tried to create a drama that explored ideas rather than did a proclamation of the truth all the time, with the Billy Graham moment at the end, God rest his soul, but it would get dismissed. Pastors would go, well, you didn't end it where people would come forward and accept Jesus into their hearts. So the sketches and music and everything needed to point to singularly a relationship with Christ, which then creates this utilitarian sensibility that then diminishes and potentially destroys artistry.
Right.
And by the way, we've left Todd out of this. I don't know if Todd, are you still there?
No, I'm still here. No, that's fine. I just want to say that Phil, starting in the middle is like Homeric tradition, I think. But there's a couple of really interesting points you guys brought up that I'd like to get at. Is you got into the point, Paul, where art can be viewed as good in a sort of functional sense. So we can look at like a pagan or secular humanist, and look at that and say, based on the creativity, the skill it put into it, that it's good. It's good art, but it's not good. It's not maximally good in the sense that all of the potential creativity that could be available to that person is used, because of course, as you were pointing out earlier, Phil, people like that shut themselves off from the true source of the creativity. So in that sense, while they sort of acknowledgingly tapping into their own skills that God gave them, they're not fully acknowledging those.
Well, they're not fully informed. I mean, you go into Greece, people will go into Roman and Greek temples and be astonished by the beauty of it, but they're temples to false gods. So there's a degree of artistry and craftsmanship that you can applaud and say this is beautiful, though it's misguided, it's misdirected.
Yeah, and here's where again things get really sticky for a lot of folks, and that is the idea of saying, okay, well, wait. And this goes, by the way, this will, what I'm about to kind of say goes both for Christians Christians in one sense, and then non-Christians in the other sense, the secular and the other sense. And that is, Todd, going back to your initial definition as you're reading through the actual definition of what art is, the dictionary definition of what art is, truth and beauty are part of those equations. And so if you were to say, okay, let's divide art up now into elements of what of truth and beauty. Let's take film for instance. You put on the side of truth the skill of the filmmaker. Are they do they understand? Do they understand what they're saying? Do the writers understand what they're saying? Do the writers have intentionality in the message they're trying to bring? Does that message ring true philosophically? Does that message ring true from a standpoint of eternity, universal truths about immutable laws of the universe? I mean, those kinds of things would fall under truth. And then, of course, when you have beauty, you talk about the aesthetics of the film. Is it well shot? Is it well lit? Is it well acted? Is it is the music, the underscore, is that all well done? And so quite frequently you'll have these, I'll put these up on a board. You'll have truth on one side and beauty on the other side, and stand between, and you say, okay, here's where it comes back to some of the very things that you were saying, Todd, and the very things that you were saying, Paul, which is, on the one hand, we have the secular filmmakers who understand beauty much better than most people do, than most Christians do, because they have the aesthetically pleasing, but they understand how to make the films, they understand camera work, they understand lighting, they understand music, they understand how to do all that stuff really well, but they have no truth in their film.
Now, could we qualify that for a second and just say, are we differentiating between beauty and craft? I'm just wondering if what we're saying is they're using craft, and they're very good at their craftsmanship.
Yes.
Which then leads to beauty, which then,
I would say that craft falls as a subset of beauty. So I would put craftsmanship under beauty. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. You've hit it right on the head. All that craftsmanship, and they're experts at it. I mean, expert at it. So they understand all of that. But then we go over to the truth side and we get tumbleweeds. We don't really have much truth there in terms of what we know in terms of our core sensibilities, what we know as Christians, what we know philosophically, what we know morally, what we know ethically. You get to Christian filmmakers, and quite often they're very heavy on the truth side, to the point of being basically mini sermons, as you were pointing out, Paul, the whole Big Graham moment at the end, God rest his soul. And but then you get over on the other side, you look over at the beauty side and you say, wait a minute, they're not quite acted very well. The craftsmanship of filmmaking, craftsmanship is not really always there. And that's why people are dissatisfied in many respects with quote unquote Christian films, because we get, wow, all sorts of truth, but without the beauty part of it, why would we want to watch it? And then on the other hand, on the other side of it, of course, the Christians come back and say, wow, got all sorts of beauty over there on the secular side, but there's no truth we can grab onto. And so we have this void from both ends. And that's where I think we get a real, that's where I think what we need is a new generation, or generations right now, of artists who understand that both are necessary. Both sides are necessary, and you have to have both sides in order to create what I would differentiate between good art and bad art. So the example that I use in one of my classes is Titanic. James Cameron is an excellent craftsman as far as filmmaking is concerned. He is a brilliant filmmaker, and wouldn't know truth if it slapped him in the face. I mean, the vast majority of that film is completely made up, and it's too bad, because the story of the Titanic in and of itself is fantastic in terms of its truth. In terms of the truth of what happened on that ship, there's some amazing stories. Why he chose to not tell those stories and make up this whole, and I'm not against fiction, believe me, the story of Rose and whatever his name is, Leonardo, is fine. All that's fine. That you can have that love story behind you. But for instance, I mean, there's a point in the film where one of the officers is upset with what's happening, and he kills himself. He shoots himself in the head. In reality, that officer was a hero. He didn't do anything of the sort. But Cameron thought it was more dramatic for him to kill himself at that point, so he just let's just change the story. Let's just change it completely. You go, well, wait a minute.
Well, and that's the point though, because that Cameron, number one, if one of the old rules is that the greatest art and especially the greatest story is about humanity, that would require you have a technician like Cameron to understand humanity and the human condition to be able to write about it, which the Titanic actually shows. The positive and negatives, how you had cowards on the ship, you had incredible courage and nobility on the ship. I would point to the 1950s Night to Remember, the British film, as a far superior film as a representation of the Titanic. But I think you've touched on that, which is you get to the core of humanity, you get to the core. And so you have great craftsmen, I mean, who are great artists who have embraced either, let's just say, the wrong worldview, and it reflects their worldview. Sometimes it reflects a worldview they don't even realize they have. Yeah, which is sometimes, and I think we've all experienced in our writing and in artistry, sometimes you're actually discovering some things about yourself in your worldview that you didn't even realize was there until somebody said, by the way, do you realize consistent in your stories, this theme seems to be emerging? And then you realize you've actually been wrestling things. It's like Steven Spielberg with The Lost Boy syndrome that comes into almost everything he does. E.T. separated from parents. You've got Empire of the Sun, boy separated from family. Almost every one of his films has a separation issue, usually with a child. Yeah. And I don't know that anyone ever sat down with Steven Spielberg and said, by the way, do you think maybe you have some issues with separation? Did something happen to you as a kid? I mean, what's going on that you're going back to this theme again and again?
Yeah, he kind of wants to remove parents from the picture. Let's just have kids deal with all of the stuff, and parents seem, one step removed from everything. But I agree with you, and so I think that what you've kind of done there then is another step in art and artistry. And another step in artistry, and this is an ongoing process, by the way. I don't think anybody ever actually gets to the point, maybe Lewis and Tolkien did, but I don't think everybody actually gets to the point where I've mastered all of this. This is kind of an ongoing situation. But I think what you've just touched upon is the idea of saying intentionality is a part of this. Understanding the nature of what you are doing when you are writing a script, when you are writing a song, when you are putting words to music, when you are there's an intentionality that goes to when you are painting. In architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright was brilliant at that. He understood exactly how to make things work together and function together. Form and function and beauty all came together. And so I think that is kind of another step in the whole idea of looking for a standard that we're operating off of here. And again, I think it goes back to the idea of that's innate within us. That is innate within us, but we have either purposefully suppressed it, or we have used, I guess, for lack of a better word, the idea of sloth or laziness, and not wanting to examine it, not wanting to explore it, and not wanting to say, okay, here's what we need to do to get it.
There's 2 points that I'd like to make. One relating to an earlier point that Paul made. Is one of the things we read when it comes to the construction of the Temple of Solomon is that something that I think we all too often overlook especially with Christian art, is that God gave a special grace to the craftsmen and the musicians. So the craftsmen who built the temple, who built the utensils of the temple, were not only great due to the skill that God imbued with them being made by God, but he gave them a special dispensation to do so. And we also see with the psalters, the musicians, when Solomon opens the temple to praise and worship God, these men who are singing and playing instruments they have a special dispensation. Sometimes I wonder if men like Handel and Bach are in many ways having a similar dispensation like these Solomonic temple musicians. And another thing that Paul brought up was the sort of, to put it maybe politely, clumsy aspect of a lot of Christian art. One aspect of it I think that's interesting is we get a lot of Sunday school version of Bible stories when, especially with the Old Testament, there's a lot of rather ugly, brutal elements like the rape of Tamar or Samson's murderous rages. And, I think it does a disservice.
I have the action figures for those, by the way.
I think it does a bit of a disservice, though, to, I understand why they want to do it. They want to make it kid-friendly, and that's fine. But I think there needs to be, without being vulgar, mature content as well. What are some of your thoughts on those 2 points?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think we should. I think that again, going back to Scripture, when we, when I was a child, I spake as a child, and I thought as a child, and I acted as a child. And when I became adult, I put away childish things. Now, I think that I know that that's specifically theological in nature. That's specifically moral and religious in nature. But I think that, again, this is part of what we're talking about here. We should be able to handle mature themes, but we should be able to handle them in a way that again reflects the image and glory and beauty of God and truth of God. So I think Hollywood used to do this really, really well. I think that in many respects, Hollywood used to make films. Secular filmmakers understood these basic principles, and they used to be able to make these films very, very well. They still had all of those elements in it. It's really funny in many ways. Putting restrictions on people helps you be more creative. You have to figure out ways to basically tell the stories in ways that people will understand what you're talking about, without having complete license to do whatever you want. Sometimes makes for a complete lack of creativity, and I think that we've seen a lot of that lately.
But to your point, the fact is, as Christians and artists, you have to explore dark aspects. You have to go into the darkness in order to bring in the light, to actually show the light. The difference, though, is that we know it's darkness and we know that we don't want to stay there, as opposed to celebrating the darkness, which is where we've come as we're celebrating things that are of the darkness. And in the restraint that they showed at one time in Hollywood, as rightfully, forced people to be more creative in how they could touch on those without wallowing in it. So the difference would be Casablanca. I've used this example. Casablanca, you have a scene where a woman comes to Humphrey Bogart to get his advice, and she describes a situation in which some very immoral and potentially terrible things might happen, that she might actually agree to do some terrible things in order to get her and her husband out of Casablanca, that she might agree to do certain things. Now, when you're watching this scene, you know exactly what she's talking about. You know what's going on. You didn't have to be gratuitous. We didn't have to be dragged through the reality of what she was asking and what she was picturing, for us to understand it, to understand his response, and to see the nobility that followed on in terms of what the character of Rick did. And I think that's going back to, in terms of our aesthetic, objective artistry, our objective aesthetic, as you put it earlier, is then we can measure that. We can, if we're going to, for example, explore the darkness, we are not untethered when we go in there. Yeah. We are tethered back to truth. We're tethered back to an objective aesthetic that says, okay, we can go this far and maintain our sensibilities. I mean, a friend of mine actually did a mock youth group bulletin in which he said, so Friday night we're going to watch the movie Hot Thighs and Wet Grass, and afterwards talk about whether or not we should have watched the movie. So the danger is you become untethered and you don't even know what the parameters are in terms of what you're exploring, because you should explore. We're exploring humanity. We're trying to enlighten, in terms of, from a Christian point of view, humanity. And that means also the dark places. but not wallowing in it or celebrating it. Todd, did I go completely off the trail?
Oh no, that's exactly the kind of content that we're missing. But I would like your thoughts maybe on the idea that even today, certain artists get a special dispensation from God, like the temple craftsmen or the temple musicians.
I think that I would call that talent. I think that that's a really, again, that's a well, how do we talk about this? I think that is, again, a very that's a situation where especially in our postmodern world and the world of young people especially, who have been told that they're special over and over and over again, they get right around this point in the conversation, again, they buck up, and it's like, well, you can't. And I understand their reticence toward that. And part of me also understands, as a writing teacher, because one of the things that I teach also is writing. I'm saying in those classes, everybody has the ability to write. Everybody has the ability to write. You can write this. Here, writing is a skill that I can teach you. I can teach you how to write and write well. I don't know that I can teach you how to write novels that everybody wants to read, but I can teach you how to write a novel. I can teach you how to format things. I can teach you how to write scripts. I can teach you how to do all of that stuff.
But you can't teach talent.
But I can't teach talent. I can't teach you talent. So I would say that dispensation of grace, to answer your question, Todd, yeah, I think that I don't think that God stopped doing that after a certain period of time. I think he imbues certain people with talents and abilities, and those talents and abilities are things that he expects them to use. I think this is the parable of the talents. Those are talents and abilities that he expects those folks to use. He has gifted them with those talents. They are above other folks' talents in the same areas. While other folks may have desire, great deals of desire, that doesn't necessarily make them capable of doing the same level of work as somebody who has just sheer raw talent does.
And you can go back to Todd, to the point, whether you call that grace or whether you just call it a manifestation of the creative spark that's in people anyway. As we said, truth out of the mouths of babes. I mean, truth comes from a number of different sources. God allows that, and I don't mean truth as in any truth. I mean the truth of God. All of nature proclaims the glory of God, we get from Scripture. Now, some people are going to look at nature and draw the wrong conclusions about what it's proclaiming. And the ongoing joke that we've had is, I live at the base of Pikes Peak, and you can look at it, and some would say, oh, that points to the glory of God. But the evangelical model would be to carve John 3:16 into the side of it, just in case people didn't get the message. So, and that's the thing about, by the way, that's the thing about beauty is, and God allows the risk that goes into it. So when you have people proclaiming truth, actually perhaps ignorantly pointing to him in their artistry, they're creating something beautiful. But now we're back to the last battle analogy of out of ignorance. They were doing something out of their instinct, out of a yearning, out of whatever it is in their humanity that points to that. And without meaning to, they are actually pointing to God without knowing that they had done it. So I do believe that it isn't always in the domain of Christianity. In fact, at this stage of things, beauty is not often in our Christian thing, because we become so utilitarian, or misinformed because we haven't been teaching it. We haven't been teaching people how to recognize truth, because they're looking at a measurable end result, which is how many people came to Jesus after they looked at this painting or saw this statue or heard this song, as opposed to, actually, like when Jesus told parables, the prodigal son could have been about a lot of different things. The Good Samaritan could have been about a lot of different things. He told stories without always explaining, except sometimes to the disciples, but he actually let people go off and think about it.
Yeah.
He let them explore the idea. And I think we would look at these stories and say, that's amazing artistry. But he wasn't always on the nose in terms of where that art was going, except he knew ultimately the Holy Spirit. And I think this is where we are as artists. Very often we need to trust the Holy Spirit to be working in the hearts of the people, and minds of the people, just as hopefully he's working in our hearts and minds for the things we're creating for them.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, absolutely spot on. I would add to that as well the idea that, okay, what do we then latch on to as if we claim to be artists, and do we know if we have talent? Which of course is the big fear here. Once you set that standard, you go, well, I don't even know if I'm really an artist. Then I have no idea. I don't, you know. But I think that what we could do, though, for myself, I think what has happened is that I would say, of the two, truth and beauty, I can latch on to truth. I can latch on to truth as a guidepost for myself. That's where when you talk about being tethered there, Paul, I think that's the tether. That's the thing that Captain America says, where you plant yourself like a tree by the river of truth and say, no, you move. So that's the idea of saying, that I'm going to latch on to that as somebody who is creative. John Cleese does a great talk about. He did many years ago a great talk about creativity. He did a great deal of investigation and research, and wrote books and did studies on this sort of thing. And one of the things he talks about is that creativity is not talent. Creativity is not a talent. We all have creativity, but we're not necessarily that. It doesn't depend on talent, and it doesn't depend on intelligence. It is not those two things. And so we say, okay, so if we differentiate between the fact that we are created in the image of God and we are created to be creative, then we have to say, as Todd, I think, is trying to get to point to, that yes, we are all creative, but we are not all talented. So
yeah.
So yes, absolutely, we are all creative, but we are not all talented, or at least we are not all talented in the same ways. We're not equally talented in the same ways and in the same areas and in the same fields and in the same, whatever. So, but the one thing you can grab onto, tether yourself to, is truth. And then you say, okay, now that I'm latched onto truth, I find truth, latch onto truth, and then go into the more nebulous, I think, area of art, which is the beauty part, and still say, now, as long as I have my anchor tethered to truth, I can go in and explore beauty, and explore it in all of its dimensions, which is what also we're talking about here in terms of the good and the bad, the really seedy parts of it, the really awful parts of it, the really the dank parts of humanity, the dank parts of the human condition, the sinful parts of the human condition. But remember always that we're tethered to the truth, and Jesus said, I am the truth. So we're really tethered to him. And the idea behind this is, yes, we're going to explore and we're going to examine artistically, from a beauty standpoint, from the craft standpoint and the beauty standpoint, all of the seedy underbelly of humanity too. We can do that as Christians, and should do that as Christians, and present that as Christians in our art. But don't just stay there. Don't just glorify it. Don't just, that's the thing that we're celebrating, as Paul just said. Don't celebrate that. Celebrate. Show it for what it is, and say, now we've got to get back. We've got to get out of it. This is kind of the whole hero's journey, going deep, dark into the cave, and now we've got to return to. We've got to return with the elixir, which is salvation. We've got to return to, with the hope, and back to the truth. I had a great heard a great talk from a pastor. We were having a meeting of all of the department that I was teaching in at that point, and he came in and said, my daughter is going to be attending your school this year. She's a freshman. She's going to go to your college this year, and we're overjoyed with it. And he said, now I know that you want to take her out to the wilderness of ideas. You're going to take her into places that she probably hasn't. No, that's the whole purpose of college. It's a university is a place where you examine ideas. You grapple with great ideas. You grapple with things that you might not. You grapple with your own worldview. You grapple with all of those kinds of things. That's the place to do that in university. He said, here's what I beg you, though. Once you get her out there, don't leave her there. Don't leave her there. Bring her back. Bring her back to the fold. Bring her back to the truth. Show her the path to get back. I feel so many And I think he was spot on. I think so much of higher education these days, and this is especially true when it comes to art, is taking people out to the wilderness and then we leave them there. And we don't show them the path to get back. That's a bad, bad thing.
Well, you know, a good point on that is you'll see a lot of movies that are very popular that deal with the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, vampires. And well, what you'll see is there's no victory over evil. The people just see this evil, and at worst they're overcome by it, and at best they escape with their shirt on. And it creates this very, well, what it reminds me of is the old pagan world before Christianity replaced it. There are the gods who were capricious and cruel that people didn't deny existed, but they were just trying to buy them off because, you know, they were so brutal and cruel. And you can almost see it coming full circle, right? Once Christianity sort of edged out, what you end up going, you know, full circle. And another element as well is that we talked about, you know, staying in the muck and then trying to go through the darkness and come to something better. I think a really good example would be Tolkien's Middle-earth versus Martin's Game of Thrones. They're both sword and sorcery, high fantasy, but, you know, what reduces Martin's, you know, work to just pedantic is just how it's just focusing on the most banal and vulgar things for no point other than itself. Whereas, you know, Tolkien does deal with difficult issues of sacrifice and hardship and fear of death, but you don't stay in the despair, right? The despair of Boromir undoes him. And so the heroes overcome that despair. So I think we see it in this sort of like parallel comparison, these two principles that we've been getting at.
Yeah, and that's a lot of it is the redemptive aspect of it. Just as Christ came, the incarnational idea, and even Tolkien talked about the You Catastrophe, I think is what he had called it, which was, you know, this idea that it just gets dark and dark and dark, and just when you think you can hardly bear it anymore, then the light breaks through, then the thing comes along that turns it all around. Yeah, the You Catastrophe.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. I mean, I think as believers are called to redeem, then to show redeem, because remember, art is not supposed to be life, it's a representation of life. Right. Which means in its representation, and I think using again the temple as an example, I think God could have just said, okay, just use whatever hut you're in. I mean, what he did though was, and I think he always does, is he wants us to raise our sights. Redemption is not just a conditional thing that happens to us, but is a very purposeful thing that helps us to raise our sights higher than where we are. And I believe that art is supposed to do that. It's not supposed to drag us in and let us wallow in the worst aspects of our humanity, but to set our sights up so that we are looking beyond where we may be. We're looking to be a nobler representation of ourselves. We're looking to be redeemed and what redemption means in terms of who we actually become. And I think that part of it is critically lost in terms of where we are. Game of Thrones being the example. Game of Thrones, from what I've seen of it, I mean, it just wallows in the worst aspects of humanity. You know, you get a glimpse of something that looks like courage, and then it turns and it becomes something else. He's constantly turning it backwards. Basically, it's like he gets glimpses of light, and then he chases us back into the darkness again. And I think people instinctively, well, we get tired of it. And the ones who don't get tired of it, I worry about because then I begin to worry that they're not even recognizing just how dark the darkness is. And like we talked about earlier, they kind of get used to it. The standard of beauty now lowers. The standard of human behavior keeps lowering and lowering. And I mean, we know from the 60s that the artists, the Beatles, were reflecting their culture, but feeding back into the culture by way of their messages and their ideology. So while they are not singularly to blame, or you can't singularly blame any one thing for what the 60s brought into the 70s, the artists are often reflecting, but the question is, what are artists reflecting back?
Right.
You know, the filter can be very dark. The worldview can be askew. And what they're doing is basically feeding the poison back into the culture. They're getting it, but rather than turn it and put it into the redemptive realm, they're basically just feeding it back and sometimes amplifying it, and to our destruction.
Yeah.
What would say art done right? You know, going through the difficult times, the difficult topics, and then showing us redemption at the other side. What would you guys say pick as some of the exemplars of that performance?
As far as, you mean like movies or or
Yeah, movies, literature. Which books or films do you think best are exemplars of that method?
Well, simplistically, Christmas Carol, I suppose, would be one. You know, if you go to the Christmas theme, It's a Wonderful Life certainly has aspects of that. Lord of the Rings, as you pointed out, certainly does. I mean, there's a whole list. It's funny in being asked, it's kind of hard to think it through, but go ahead.
I think Casablanca is one. I think definitely
Yeah.
one. Ben-Hur
Yeah.
is a primary
Oh,
example.
yeah.
Ben-Hur.
Yep.
He physically walks from darkness into light at the foot of the cross, and you go, "Oh, wow, that's just a fantastic representation of what we're talking about here." I think probably, and this is only natural. I think probably if you were to poll, which you're doing, you're polling Paul and myself about these things, we have a tendency to go back to classic films and stuff because we've seen them so many times and we have examined them so many times. As far as more modern things are concerned, I think that some of the more comic book nature, the Marvel verse, has some of it in it. But I think what they try to do in those movies and some of the other films that are like it, again, is to glorify the wrong things. What we really are interested in, I think, and I think on a subconscious level, people understand this. What we're really interested about those superheroes is not what that makes them different from us, but what makes them like us. We have to identify with them in some way, and so we want to say, do I have that within me? Do I have the ability to do that within me? Do I have the ability to stand up in the face of great evil and take it on? And or would I run?
And by the way, and we've done that. Adventures in Odyssey explored that throughout its entire life, which was really the question of, we are faced with choices throughout our life, and this is part of story. We are presented with choices, and the question is, do we do the hard thing in how we make our choices, the godly thing, the hard thing in how we respond, or do we do the easy thing that may not be the godly thing? And we were constantly putting the characters into those situations and showing what the choices could be like, but never flinching from the choices being hard and the consequences of the choices being hard. And so here's an example. This is a hard film to watch, by the way, but Calvary, film that was done a couple of years ago and set in Ireland. And it's a painful film to watch. And yet I believe it comes to a very redemptive end, subtle, but it is a redemptive ending that instills redemption. And with redemption, by the way, is the idea of hope. That's another key thing that when we're talking about the kinds of films we think, or any artistry, is it instills a sense of hope. Even in the darkness, there's a sense of hope. So I would point to that one as a more contemporary film that explores the themes we're talking about, does it in a certain way, but it's not family fare. It is not something that, I would recommend anyone to sit. In fact, I'd recommend you need to watch it alone before you even watch it with your husband or wife, because it's hard, because it does go to the dark places, but does come back out again.
Well, and that's what I think that is very interesting. You touched on there is we also need to. This is why the study of this is very important. We also need to understand how to recognize redemptive stories when we see them, because quite often the stories don't seem to be about that, but they're about something else. A good example is the film As Good as It Gets, with Jack Nicholson and Helen Hunt and Greg Kinnear. You know, there are a lot of elements of stuff like that that people would watch who are Christians who would say, "Oh, I don't know if I should be watching this stuff." But if you look at the film as a whole, you have Jack Nicholson's character is basically a racist, sexist, misogynistic. You know, he's not a good guy, but he's not a good guy because he has a medical problem. He has a condition. Okay, but by the end of the film, he is actually very redeemed. He goes through a situation and has, by the way, I think one of the best scenes in it, with one of the most best written scenes in it, and that scene pretty much embodies the whole nature of the film. And when he goes through it, he delivers within context, I think, one of the best lines in motion picture history. And of course, it's Jack Nicholson, so he delivers it really, really well. But it's a wonderful, and I won't tell you what it is because I want everybody to go watch it. But the idea behind it is you look at that and you say, wow, here's a character. But if you look at it just from the film standpoint, you don't see, you wouldn't say that this is a film about redemption. But it actually is a film about redemption. It's about this man going through the things that he goes through, and how does he end up on the other end? He starts in one place, this is a very dark place, and he ends up in a very good place, in a very light place.
Well, and that's the difficult thing, because very often when we say redemption, people are thinking in a very literal, again, Billy Graham moment kind of redemption. Whereas redemption, when we're talking about redemption, comes in many forms. And I'm not talking strictly theologically in terms of salvation. We are talking about a redemption and hope that is leading people from darkness to light, basically, and trying to bring some degree. I mean, it was my father-in-law who was never a particularly artistic person in an obvious way. But you know, when we talk about art and we talk about movies, one day he just kind of threw it out. He said, basically, as far as I'm concerned, a movie should either give you insight into your life or help you to forget about your life. And if it doesn't do either one of those things, then it's a complete waste of time. And I came away and said, I think that's as good a summary as I've heard in a long time. Yeah. And it's absolutely right. We're looking for, actually what you want is both, something that's that's entertaining you, but also giving you insight. And that's, I think, a key thing. And insight, I equate with the sense of redemption. Yeah. Because to me, it's not insightful to think people die lonely and miserable deaths. Right. You know, there's nothing insightful about that. Right. You know, war is a terrible thing. I get it. There's no insight in that. We get that. But how a person conducts himself in war, how a person conducts himself or herself in terms of life and life choices and sacrifice and all the things that we see in Jesus, then is the thing that points to redemption.
Yeah.
I think there's one element that we did overlook. It's very important, I think, as a genre. We talked about the art that focuses on redemption. We've talked about the art that focuses on the banality of evil for its own sake. But there's another view that I think is at least helpful in getting people closer to the redemptive art. And this is what I call the Ecclesiastes style art. It is hopeless in the sense that the characters can't get out. But what it does is it helps frame reality so that people begin to learn they need to know salvation. I'll give you two examples. Kabayoshi is The Human Condition, the Japanese trilogy, and Akira Kurosawa's Ran. Those are both movies without hope, but they are instructive movies in that they show us that by our own strength, in the world we live in, we are without hope. And in that sense, they are helpful, even if they don't give an answer.
Well, I mean, Pink Floyd's The Wall. If you ever watched that movie, Pink Floyd's The Wall, to me, I came away and went, oh, so this is what life looks like for people who don't know Jesus, which is a bit simplistic. But the difference, though, is intentionality. I'm not entirely sure that the creators of The Wall knew that that's what they were doing. They were showing a particular life, and they were talking about emotional isolation and not even touching on the spiritual reality of it. Whereas I suspect the examples you gave, there was an intentionality, if not necessarily point to God, but I mean, there's always room for morality lessons within the context of tragedy. You know, you could do Count of Monte Cristo in many ways. I mean, it's a book about revenge, and you get to the end of it, and then the lesson is, You really shouldn't have done all that revenge stuff. You know, but you get the point. You get the idea. So a bit simplistic, but you know what I mean. So you're absolutely right. There's room for that. But again, it's intentionality, as Phil said earlier. And it's a question of, if we're going to be left without hope, if we're actually looking as an example of life without hope, or what it could be like if we were in nothing but darkness, then the question is, well, where do we go from there? And that's the other issue. In many of these cases, some of the films are created at a time when you could assume that the culture knew what it was doing, and that the end result was supposed to point you, even from the negative, it's going to point you to the positive. Right now, as a culture, I think we are just so lost and confused that you try to create those movies and it becomes a celebration of the darkness again, because people have lost that foundation, the tethering, that would tell them, oh yeah, I get what you're doing here, because that's pointing me into the other direction. Now people get stuck and they just go, oh yeah, this is where we are. And then they go out and commit suicide after watching the movie.
Yeah.
Because they don't even know where the hope is.
Right. Or they recycle back to
Right.
things. I think it happens more often than not. I mean, No Country for Old Men is like that. This
Yeah.
is a classic example of basically nihilism. It's just, there's no hope at the end of this thing. That's it. I mean, we have Tommy Lee Jones's character who's like, that's it. This is the way it works. Okay, we're just dead. We're, you know, life happens, bad things go on. Sometimes you get a laugh or two, and then you die, and that's it. Well, I think that a lot of people, like you said, there's some people who that's going to affect in terms of saying, oh, well, if it's truly a meaningless existence, then what difference does it make?
Right.
You know, why try? And then those people may take the ultimate way out. But I think a lot of it deals with, yes, we explore these themes, and for me, I understand what you're saying, Todd, in terms of these are sort of ecclesiastical pre-evangelism sort of movies, because you can point to them and say, really, is this the attractive thing? Why are you attracted to this? Why would we be attracted to this sort of art? Why are you attracted to meaninglessness? You know, how come you think that's better than, for instance, saying, you know, here's life over here that can go on, and that we can see in terms of truth, beauty, and goodness, and perhaps we should strive for those things, even if we don't actually achieve them. Aren't we better off striving for them than just, you know, living in the meaninglessness and the
well, and the fascinating thing about Ecclesiastes is it ends with hope. It gives the answer. The last two verses still end. I mean, we spend all of those chapters dealing with this, and we still come down to the end of the matter, which is fear God and obey his commandments. This sums up the duty of mankind. For God will bring everything we do to judgment, and every secret, whether good or bad. So even in that, you still have, it's like the chapter with David. I love that moment when David, you know, commits adultery, has the husband murdered, does all of this stuff, and God is nowhere to be found until the last verse, when it says, and God saw what David did and was not pleased, to put it in an understated way. And so, you know, even in those moments, and this is why I think we have to be incredibly careful if we're going to say, okay, well, let's do a story or let's make a movie that's just going to go into the darkness and not come out as some sort of a morality tale. I'll tell you, there are some people who might be able to do that, do it well, and pull it off so that you're not left in the darkness. But I think at this stage of our culture, I don't even know that I would advise anybody to make a movie like that if they're trying to do it for a Christian reason.
But, you know, I also think, though, that we have, again, except for those whose minds are perhaps so hurt and twisted and so repressed that they can't think in terms of getting out of this. I think once again, going back to Romans, we have this innate thing within us that says, but this isn't really reality. Yes, we're showing the darkness of humanity. Okay, yes, we are. And sometimes we've all gone through elements in our times in our lives where everything seemed hopeless. But that doesn't always, but just staying hopeless doesn't ring true. That again goes against our core sensibilities. You've had, for proof, I offer people in concentration camps. I offer, you know, the Jews who were being slaughtered wholesale by the Nazis in concentration camps and still found a way to have a culture, still found a way to do art, still found a way to have hope, still found a way to see goodness in things. So if you put people in the worst situations that humans can create, and I think as low as humans can go, that's how low they'll go, you still have in these situations people who understand hope, and for the most part strive for it, want it. It doesn't ring true that we just need, that it's all just meaningless and we're just going to stay here and that's the way life is. It simply goes against our core, that core element of saying, you know, we are without excuse. God planted this inside of us and we all have it there. And if we're not looking at it in that respect, it's because we are purposefully suppressing it. And for those people, again, who have gone the whole distance with this and are just so depressed clinically.
The Romans chapter 1 example.
Yeah, where it just
they've cut themselves off.
They have cut themselves off from it. They refuse to acknowledge it, and now what hope do they have? They have none. So I think you're absolutely right in saying, you know, in this kind of atmosphere that we're living in right now, it would be very, very, very non-advisable to make a film.
Let's just be careful. Let's be careful. Yeah.
But we also want, though, to bring artistry into films. Like, if we're going to do something like that, bring artistry into it to again, not cliched, not in a non-artistic and non-talented way, but to show them the path out, to show them the way back. How do we get back to where we need to be, and it's where we know, the places where we know are good, and good over bad and truthful over falsehood.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt, but Paul, you said you have some time constraints. Should we be wrapping this up?
Yeah, it's probably a good idea. I thought, well, I had something that I thought was happening at a half hour ago. Fortunately, it's kind of held off, but it could change, and I don't want people walking in.
Oh, sure.
Not understanding.
Well, I will say this: it's always great talking to you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to join this stream. Do you have any final words you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Well, thank you. It's hard to summarize. I think this has been a great discussion and worth exploring on an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
As Phil said, I mean, this is sort of a discussion Phil and I have been having for like 30 years. So, and it's still fascinating to come back to it again and again. And because we're always seem to be getting experientially and just through our learning, new perspectives, new ideas, new approaches. But I'm glad that you asked us to do this.
Yeah, me too. I want to thank you very much for doing this, Todd. I was just going to say the exact same thing that Paul said, which is this seems to be like part one of an ongoing discussion, but I think it's a fascinating and needful one. It's something that we really need to understand. Again, just from the standpoint of the experiences of teaching young people, especially, well, they want to come in, they want to learn this stuff, they want to talk about this stuff. And nobody has explained it to them. Nobody has really sat down and said, and it's not that, you know, we're the grand poobahs here and know everything about. I'm learning about this too. I don't have all the answers on this, but I have come to these certain signposts, you know, these checkpoints where I say, well, wait a minute, you know, there's got to be. I think what we're really talking about here is standards. I think what we're really talking about here is this and this and this, and everybody wants those things, but we don't know how to get to them. And I think that discussions like this are worthwhile. And I thank you, Todd, for bringing us together. I've been wanting to do something like this for a long time, and I'm glad we've had somebody else come along and go, hey, yeah, you know what? Let's get together and do this. So.
Yeah, normally we're doing this in a coffee shop somewhere or wherever we happen to be, then we're doing this and people are sitting around us wondering what in the world we're going on about. But yeah, thanks for doing this.
Would you guys be interested in making this like maybe a monthly or every other month kind of a thing?
Yeah, we could come back to this, sure.
Yeah, we can work it out. That'd be fantastic.
Oh, because I would love to. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Philly podcast, signing off.